Smokeless tobacco has been used for hundreds of years. More recently, due to cancer concerns, there has been a major shift in the kind of product preferred. These days, you're seeing less and less use of dipping and chewing tobacco, and more use of alternatives, and that's the topic of today's discussion. Okay, so let's talk about smokeless tobacco in general. You got all sorts of different kinds. You have things like dip, chewing tobacco, snuff. Then you have what I would consider alternatives. Same things, Swedish snus and nicotine salt pouches, and there's some others. These are really the main topic of today's video, specifically this one, but we're going to hit on what dip is and chew is and snuff is for those of you who do not know. So there is a variety of risks and benefits. A lot of us are aware of the risks like cancers, addiction, oral and dental issues, specifically, for smokeless tobacco. And some of us are aware of the benefits. Compared to smoking, they're much better for your lungs and your heart, depending on the kind of smokeless tobacco. And depending on the kind of smokeless tobacco, it can be safer than smoking. And really what we're talking about here is the nicotine salts and the Swedish snus. The other benefits, it provides a lot of focus. This is just the benefits of the nicotine itself: energy, decreased anxiety, and others. So you got all sorts of stuff to choose from. You got brands, flavors, and other preferences, like the amount of nicotine and things like that. The smokeless tobacco industry is a billion-dollar industry, but there are some issues. There's all sorts of concerning chemicals in smokeless tobacco products. I'm going to list a couple of these. So we have N-nitrosamines and tobacco-specific nitrosamines. And there's a wide range of these present in tobacco, specifically the tobacco leaf, but these are some of the main carcinogens in smokeless tobacco. Then you have other things like aldehydes, like formaldehyde. You have heavy metals, like arsenic, lead, and others. And you have what are called radioelements, things like polonium-210, uranium-235, and 238. And these are present in very small amounts. Now, a lot of these chemicals from my research came from this study done in the 90s, but a lot of the modern studies seem to make this kind of like the benchmark when it comes to understanding what is in smokeless tobacco products. Now, these N-nitrosamines or tobacco-specific nitrosamines are produced when the plant is grown, cured, fermented, and aged. As I mentioned before, there's a wide range of these compounds in amounts and all sorts of things. So this study was very general, but it did provide some insight into the harmful chemicals that can be found in these products. But these chemicals are not found in all of these products. Let's get specific into some of these types of smokeless tobacco. So let's start off talking about chewing tobacco. A lot of us in the US have heard about chewing tobacco. So this is loose leaf tobacco. It also goes by plug and twist. These, from what I see, are not really used heavily anymore. You might find them used in the South, just forms of chewing tobacco. The tobacco is cured, and that can be air or fire. It's also coarse in its texture. Now, for these products, they are placed in the cheek gum area. A lot of us know that. Chewing tobacco is not dip. Dip is a form of what's called moist snuff. The texture is also different. The texture of dip is finer than chewing tobacco. It's chopped up, packed together. It really depends on the type of chewing tobacco. Various flavors, also plenty of room for cancers. This can be oral cancers and all sorts of nasty stuff. So moist snuff. So moist snuff it's tobacco that's cured, just like regular chewing tobacco is. It's got a lot of water content, up to 50% water, with plenty of flavors and additives. Definitely has high cancer-causing potential. I did mention that the texture is finer, and there's all sorts of different brands like Copenhagen and many, many more. One thing I wanted to mention is spitting. So the reason why people have to spit is with these products, you create a lot of saliva, especially with something like moist snuff. And one of the reasons why you have to spit is because if you swallow it, you will experience some pretty horrendous gastrointestinal upset. You might vomit, a lot of stuff you don't really want. Now, speaking of moist snuff and chewing tobacco, the dangers when it comes to smokeless tobacco really lie in these two forms, but specifically moist snuff. So we'll say MS for moist snuff, CT for chewing tobacco. In that study I mentioned, that older study, and in modern studies, they see about over 27 dangerous chemicals in moist snuff specifically. So we have our tobacco-specific nitrosamines that I talked about. The metals can also include cadmium and chromium. You don't want heavy metals in your diet. They're not good for you. And the cancers can be esophageal, pancreatic, oral, all sorts of different things. One interesting point is that this specific paper I read talked about how the tobacco-specific nitrosamine count went up as products like Copenhagen aged. Now, again, this is a very general statement, but in this paper, they were really looking at how do these compounds change as far as the amount is concerned as they are left to age. And this is something that they found. Then we have dry snuff or nasal snuff. So this is finely ground tobacco leaf. This can be snorted. Let's zoom in to this picture here. So see, we have a guy from back in the day snorting dry snuff. And here's his little container, and he's putting it on his thumb and snorting it. So this is a consumption method for tobacco. I was not aware of this. I don't know how common this is. It seemed to be a popular option for some people. I saw some people on Reddit that were still doing it, but it's one of the many ways to consume tobacco. And one other point I want to mention is it carcinogenic? And from the research I found is that there's very little evidence that it is carcinogenic, but there seems to be a lot more research that needs to be done. So let's continue. Now, these two are the alternatives to dipping tobacco, chewing tobacco, specifically because they seem to be a lot safer. So let's talk about Swedish snus. Well, these are used in Sweden, as the name suggests. This is a very interesting kind of smokeless tobacco. This is a form of dry snuff, so similar to the stuff that guy was sniffing in the last slide. It's a loose powder. It looks like it's present in these little tea bags. Well, they look like tea bags, as you can see down here. So let's look at what's inside of these things. So you have tobacco leaf, you have salt, you have food grade flavorings, we'll just say FGF. These products are not fermented. So the leaf is not fermented, which means it has less tobacco-specific nitrosamine count and less bacteria. The bacteria kind of help with that production. Because of this, these are a much safer option compared to other smokeless tobacco products that have the tobacco plant inside them. They also don't contain heavy additives or heavy metals or any of that nasty stuff you'll find in the dip or chew. You also don't need to spit with these products. So let's get into the nicotine pouches, specifically the nicotine salt pouches. And there are many options like Zyn, O, Velo. We're going to use Zyn as an example because here in the US, there's a huge trend of Zyn being used all over the place. So that's going to be kind of our example for the smokeless tobacco nicotine salt pouches. So you got Zen Dry, talk about that. About 3% moisture. So what's inside? Well, you got a nicotine salt. Talk about that in a second. Those are extracted from the tobacco plant. You have some plant fibers. These are natural fibers. A lot of this is what the package is made out of. Then you have some fillers, flavorings. You have sweeteners. Then you have things to adjust the pH and things to stabilize the whole mixture. Then you have Zen Moist, about 30% more moisture, up to 30% moisture. More nicotine actually within the Zen Moist. There's a nicotine salt solution. It's not completely dry like the last one. And you pretty much have the same exact stuff in there. You're going to add some emulsifiers and maybe some humectants, kind of keep things together. And according to Reddit, the good people of Reddit, this one is easier on the gums. I'm assuming because you don't have to get it wet, it's kind of already there. And compared to other products, they're very similar things. In O and Velo, it's not really a huge difference. They might use different types of nicotine salts. But that's pretty much the rundown. One thing I wanted to mention is that these fillers, pH adjusters, stabilizers, and things like that, these are not carcinogenic. A lot of these things you'll find in other products like chewing gum and things like that. So these are all food grade additives. Let's zoom in. So the main benefit of nicotine salt pouches is the sublingual delivery. So when you have a drug that dissolves sublingually or anything you put under your tongue, it rapidly goes into circulation and avoids the first pass, which is basically the process our liver uses to dramatically reduce drugs in our system, so we use the bare minimum. This kind of avoids that, which is why it kicks in quickly and is relatively potent. Okay, let's continue. So we know that nicotine is highly addictive. One interesting thing about it is that it is a stimulant and it's a sedative. It's one of those really interesting molecules that kind of has both properties depending on how much you consume. It does reduce anxiety, and it releases these neurotransmitters to help us feel good. Now, over here, we do have an increase of heart rate and blood pressure. We also have a decreased appetite when nicotine is consumed. Then you have some other benefits. You have an increase in energy. We've mentioned this earlier. Energy, increase in mood, a decrease in stress. It's relaxing, and it is a neuroprotective. Really useful for those neurons. Here we're just talking about nicotine. We're not considering all the stuff you might find in dipping tobacco, for example. So let's go down and talk about nicotine salt. So what is a nicotine salt? Well, the nicotine salt is nicotine plus an acid. So for example, there's all kinds of acids that are used. Lactic acid is one. Benzoic acid is another. Levulinic acid is another. You combine one with nicotine, you get a salt. It seems like nicotine benzoate is one of the more popular salts. A little bit hard to find on some of these websites, but really you'll find one of these three. So why salts? I mentioned this earlier. You have a faster absorption. You get a bigger delivery of nicotine in the system compared to something like smoking. Well, what other reasons are there? Well, there's health and safety. You're reducing those tobacco-specific nitrosamines. They're really not present at all. There's no heavy metals or any other nasty additives. They're very clean products and much better than dipping or chewing tobacco. And also much better than smoking. That includes cigarettes and vaping. So let's briefly talk about the mechanism of addiction and dependence. This is going to be very general. So when we use nicotine, it hijacks the reward pathway of the brain. And it's really using this natural pathway we have to make us feel good. So this reward pathway activates in all sorts of different ways. So when we dance, if you like to dance, sex, eating, like eating foods we love, doing hobbies or creative things. This feedback allows our brain to give us these feel-good chemicals as a reward for doing the things that we do. It's just naturally how the brain functions. Nicotine takes advantage of this, which is where the addiction and dependence comes in. Now, before we get into this, I want to make a point here. Here in the United States and also all over the world, we love drugs. We love drugs like caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, cannabis. Especially in the US, we love our amphetamines like Adderall. I wanted to make this point because nicotine by itself, we know it's addictive, right? And I think sometimes we can demonize people who use nicotine or maybe cannabis. But as a society, we're heavy drug users in that we love stimulants. We love caffeine. Many of us don't put caffeine in the category of drugs, but it is a psychoactive substance. And don't even get me started on amphetamines. In my opinion, in the United States, we have a huge amphetamine problem. We're giving this stuff to kids that are very young, in my opinion, too young to take this stuff. I made a video on Adderall and things like that like a year ago. I might make another one. But I just wanted to put this all into context because nicotine is one of the many drugs that we love, at least here in America. So the reward pathway. This is a makeshift drawings of some neurons. They're pretty bad, but they serve a point. So when nicotine is consumed, it connects to these receptors, these little parking places. We consume it and our brain's like, wow, I like this feeling. I really like how this is making me feel. This feels really good. And as we consume more and more nicotine, our brain is telling us we need more. And as we consume it and as we become dependent on it, our brain's like, we need more and more and more and more. And this is where you get caught in this loop. And this loop is constantly telling you, where's our nicotine? So the effects of that, of nicotine consumption, I mentioned before, lowered anxiety. It allows you to relax, but you also have cravings. And these can be very intense depending on how addicted you are. And these cravings, we're talking about things like smoking, right? We're talking about nicotine in general. Smoking, smokeless tobacco products, we'll say STP. This includes like Zyn and chewing tobacco. I also want to mention caffeine. Obviously, we're not talking about caffeine, but in this little point I made here about us loving our drugs, many of us cannot go a day without having our coffee. If we don't have our coffee, we're cranky and agitated. Well, because this is happening. This same thing is happening. Now, the scale of addiction is different, but it's that reward pathway is being hijacked. Agitation. This isn't directly relating to those cravings. And some say it does cause GI upset. This is specifically for the nicotine salts and things like that. Many complain of mouth sores when it comes to the nicotine salts. Also with things like dipping and chewing tobacco. Cost is another thing. I don't think these cans of things like Zyn cost a whole lot, but if you're constantly consuming them, I'm sure it does put a little dent in your bank account because you're trying to feed that addiction and that dependence. From my research, the addiction is really the only major concern for these pouches like the snooze and the nicotine salt pouches. There needs to be a lot more research, but that's really it. But this is a relatively serious thing because it can affect your life. So let's continue. I mentioned earlier that over the past handful of years, really maybe 10, 15 years, there has been a rise in different types of smokeless tobacco products. Specifically, things like Zyn has been coming up the last 5 or 6 years and others. This is a more than a $2 billion industry, and Zyn has the overall market share. I'm just going to say OMS. More people are choosing Zyn than others, at least here in the United States. You see it everywhere, all across TikTok and Instagram and everywhere. Over the next 7 years, 2023 to 2030, the industry is expected to increase by 35%. This is a huge, huge industry, and they market it to all sorts of different age groups. This is the overall stats. Let's focus in on Zyn. I just want to talk about Zyn for a second. In 2021, there are about 180 million cans sold. Last year, in 2022, there's probably a whole lot more. So many different flavors. I mean, you can go on TikTok and Instagram and go through pages of people rating the different flavors. Everyone's got a preference. From the research I did, it seemed like the traditional mint or like peppermint was very popular, but people have different options they like. And you have a couple choices of nicotine, I think 3 milligrams and 6 milligrams. Other brands have more or less. Again, it depends on what you want. Not everyone likes Zyn. Some people like O or Velo. A lot of different options. Now, when it comes to things like the addiction, then you have some downsides. Gum irritation. Some complain of GI upset. Then you have the addiction potential. The issue here is that because they're so easy to use and to buy, it's very easy to get addicted to them. You can go from 1 pouch to 2 pouches. Next thing you know, you're at 4 or 5 pouches a day just trying to get your fix. It can quickly become a problem. And there's not a lot of data on like the long-term implications of these pouches. A big issue that people have is the advertising. It's really marketed towards younger and younger people. Why? Because they're trying to get younger people addicted early, because that's their target population. These companies know nicotine's addictive, so let's sell it. They taste good, they feel good, you're not going to get cancer. I mean, this is so easy to advertise to people. I guess we'll see what happens in the coming years, but younger and younger people seem to be using these products. Now, if you're going to vape or smoke cigarettes, this is the best option for you, especially if you're going to consider dip or chew. This seems to be much, much better, the snus and the salts. Now, many doctors will say, and I agree, that there's a lot of mystery behind what might be in these products or what the long-term effects may be, but if you're going to consume them, it seems like, as I mentioned, the snus and salts are much better for you than other options. Because at least you're not messing up your lungs or getting oral cancer or pancreatic cancer or something crazy like that. And as I mentioned before, there are a lot of other options. I see here there's Velo and there's O, I know is one of them. There's a bunch to choose from. I'm not familiar with the specifics here in the US. I know that there's a lot to choose from here in the States. There are other options in other countries. But regardless, nicotine salt pouches are becoming more common in their use. So let's go through the summary and review what we learned. So we first talked about smokeless tobacco in general, dipping tobacco, chewing tobacco, nicotine salt pouches, snuff, variety of risks and benefits. Risks like cancers and benefits like being safer on the lungs, also greater focus, energy, low anxiety. A lot of different options to choose from, but among some tobacco products, you have some very concerning chemical agents that can be carcinogenic, like tobacco-specific nitrosamines, things like heavy metals that you do not want in your body, radio elements, and others. Then we got specific. We talked about things like chewing tobacco, moist snuff, dry snuff, nasal snuff, and we discussed that chewing tobacco and moist snuff have a greater potential to cause things like cancer and all sorts of other issues because of the compounds in these products, specifically moist snuff, which has been found to have a whole host of nasty chemicals. Then we talked about the other smokeless tobacco products like Swedish snus that look like these little tea bags with loose powder in them. They have the tobacco plant, but they carry a lot less risk of cancer and other things compared to chewing tobacco or dip tobacco. Then we discussed the nicotine salt pouches with a focus on Zen. We talked about Zen Dry and Zen Moist. Outside of the nicotine salt, they have regular fillers, stabilizers, pH adjusters that you'll find in other products that you consume or have consumed. We briefly just touched on nicotine and nicotine salts. We know that nicotine is highly addictive. It's a stimulant and it's a sedative. It lowers appetite. It can be good for enhanced mood, reduced stress, greater energy. These nicotine salts are nicotine and acids combined, nicotine benzoate being a popular one. There's a greater advantage because you get better absorption, more nicotine, and they're easier on your health compared to dip tobacco, for example. We then did a very brief explanation of the addiction, right? Our brain, when we consume nicotine, our brain's like, wow, I like this stuff. And then we want more and more and more. And then by the time you know it, you're in the throes of addiction and dependence because you crave it more and more. And this can apply to other things. On a day-to-day basis, a lot of us need caffeine because of this reason. And then we discussed some of the general effects, as I mentioned before, lower anxiety, these strong cravings. And this is the same for vaping, smoking cigarettes, doing smokeless tobacco, consuming caffeine. And then from constant use, at least with the salt pouches, people have complained about things like mouth sores and other complaints that we didn't get into. Then we closed out talking about the industry as a whole. We focused in on Zen because it's so popular here in the United States. Millions of cans sold, the downsides being things like gum irritation, gastrointestinal upset, specifically addiction. There's not a lot of long-term data, but these options are much safer than dipping tobacco, chewing tobacco, vaping, or smoking. So that's all I got. I've seen this stuff pop up on social media, so I thought to myself, why not make a quick video just to give some general insight into what this stuff is. I learned a lot. I didn't know anything at all about nicotine salt pouches, so it was cool for me to do some research. I hope you guys learned something new. And as always, thank you so much for watching and listening. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Tell your friends, and I'll be back soon with another video.